All right. Hi, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started here real quick, just to do a quick tech check. I do just want to reach out and check and see if one of my panelists is on the line. Dr. Leonard, can you hear me?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Perfect. We can hear you. Awesome. Great. Well, in that case, let's get this started. So thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today. My name is Theo Koboski, and I'm the manager of Ocean Conservancy's Ocean Network program, and I'm also joined today by my colleague, Adam Mitzler, who is helping to run the show from behind the scenes, and I'm here to just kick things off before I hand it over to our speakers for the afternoon. So we are here today to talk to you about the ocean and climate change, which is a really big topic lately. We're fresh off some of the largest citizen climate demonstrations we've seen in history. Just this past Friday, the UN kicked off Climate Week this week, which will be filled with lots of different climate-related events in New York and beyond. But in the ocean community, we are paying extra close attention to the release of a new special report expected to come out tomorrow from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. And this new report is going to shine a spotlight on the science and the impacts of climate change on ocean, coastal, polar and mountain ecosystems, and on the different human communities that depend on these ecosystems. And it'll be just the beginning of a series of major events playing out over the next year that will provide some really critical opportunities for ocean supporters to call for action and for leaders around the world to start to answer that call. And so in anticipation of all of that, we at Ocean Conservancy are trying to use this moment as an opportunity to take stock of not just the science surrounding the ocean and climate change, but also the discussion about how the ocean plays a really big role in climate solutions. And so in our webinar today, we're going to cover a few different things. First, we're going to kind of go back to basics and try and lay the informational groundwork to better understand why the ocean is such a central part of the climate discussion. Then we'll go a little deeper into this new IPCC report and talk about some of the impacts we can expect to see discussed in the report. And then we'll pivot and talk about how we as policy advocates and as ocean advocates can start to think about solutions and how the ocean fits into solutions. And then we'll explore a little bit how those solutions are starting to translate into action. And so without further ado, I will introduce our wonderful speakers for the afternoon that we are very lucky to have joining us. First is Dr. Sarah Cooley, who's the director of the Ocean Acidification Program here at Ocean Conservancy. And we'll also be joined by Dr. George Leonard, who is Ocean Conservancy's chief scientist. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Theo. First, I'm going to take us on a little tour to think about the science and why do we really want to talk about the ocean and climate together. The ocean and our climate are inextricably linked. Our ocean plays a major role in regulating the Earth's climate and atmosphere. At the same time, changes to the climate have very real and tangible impacts on the ocean. We cannot alter one without impacting the other. The biggest link between the ocean and climate comes from the role as a carbon and heat sink or collection point. Carbon dioxide that enters the atmosphere is absorbed by the ocean in two ways, through physical and chemical processes, and through biological activity for marine plants and creatures. On the right side of the slide, we have the physical pump. Carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater and is distributed across the ocean by the currents and ocean circulation. It's estimated that the ocean holds about 50 times more carbon than the entire atmosphere. On the left side, we show the biological pump. Plants like mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes, and algae, and other marine organisms that make energy and tissues from photosynthesis remove dissolved carbon dioxide from the surface of seawater. These organisms then remove bacteria that break it down. It's also important to recognize that the ocean absorbs vast amounts of heat compared to land and the atmosphere. Climate change carbon dioxide brought on by human emissions means the ocean is undergoing rapid changes that have serious consequences. As the ocean absorbs more and more carbon, its chemistry is changing. This is the root cause of ocean acidification, which has very damaging effects on marine life and human communities that depend on marine resources. Also, the ocean is getting hotter fast. The uppermost 250 feet of the ocean is warming the fastest, by an average about 0.11 degrees Celsius each decade since the 1970s. The upper ocean is where most marine life exists, and many species aren't ready for these major changes in temperature. Marine heat waves, which happen when temperatures near the surface of the ocean can spike up several degrees above the average, have increased by more than 50% over the past century. Coral reefs in particular are feeling the effects. A paper published in Nature reported that a 2016 marine heat wave caused bleaching in 1/3 of the almost 4,000 individual reefs that comprise the Great Barrier Reef. Here in the United States, those on the West Coast may remember the blob from 2014. That was a huge mass of extra warm water off the North American Pacific coast. NOAA reported this month that the blob has returned and it's on track to be as strong as the 2014 event. 5 years ago, the blob disrupted Western Pacific ecosystems and food webs, deeply hurting fisheries in Washington, Oregon, California, and Alaska. The new blob continues to grow, and we can expect similar effects as in 2014. Warmer seas mean stronger storms. Changes in temperature will impact El Nino and other processes that play an enormous role in the planet's weather. Hurricanes and cyclones are predicted to hold more energy, more rain, and therefore be more devastating. Earlier this month, the havoc of Hurricane Dorian was exacerbated by the fact that its slow speed led it to stall out directly over the Bahamas. NOAA scientists say storms have slowed down by 17% in the last century, and they think climate change is to blame. Slower storms mean more rain and more damaging wind for longer periods of time over the same areas, compounding those extreme hazards to communities. We still don't know the degree of warming we'll experience or the measure of harm that we'll see. This is an infographic we developed to show the possible ocean futures under 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of average global warming. The reason we don't know exactly what changes we'll see in the ocean is because we still don't know exactly what the future emissions of greenhouse gases will be. This future is entirely on us as humans to decide. Together, we decide whether more or less carbon dioxide is going to be released. So in that sense, we really control the future of the ocean. Lesser warming by a measure of even just 0.5 degree Celsius can mean drastically different impacts on the ocean. 2 degrees of warming by 2100 could double the decline in global marine fisheries that happens compared to 1.5 degrees of warming. And it could be the difference between near total extinction for the world's coral reefs versus a chance at recovery. But the key takeaway is every extra bit of warming further worsens ocean changes and impacts. And likewise, every bit we reduce warming and climate change, the better we can reduce impacts. Climate change isn't an all or nothing response. The greater our ambition, the better off we and the oceans will be. Tomorrow, a new report is coming out that will synthesize what we do know. Decades of research have provided clear evidence of the ocean's central role in regulating the global climate system, but the fast pace of climate change has left the ocean struggling to keep up. For the last 2 decades, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, has released reports pulling together the best available science on climate change. This week, the IPCC is planning to release a special report that details the current and future climate impacts on our oceans and how confident the science is in the predictions. It's called the Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. That's a mouthful, so some people call it the Oceans and Cryosphere Report, and some people call it SROCC. Based on the pre-released outline of the report and based on the existing science, we believe the SROCC report is going to shore up the following takeaways. First, for the people and marine ecosystems in the Arctic and polar regions, Climate change isn't a future debate, but it's a daily reality, and the threats are getting worse. Second, changing ocean conditions mean marine ecosystems are changing, and this is bringing new challenges to human communities and industries like fisheries who depend on these ecosystems. Third, sea level rise is accelerating, and this brings serious consequences for coastal populations. Fourth, the cumulative effect of these impacts will have major implications for the economic well-being of coastal communities. Now we'll dive a little deeper into these topics, and then we'll discuss how this information makes a strong case for ocean-smart climate solutions. The Arctic is on the front lines of climate change. It's warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. On July 4th of this year, at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, Anchorage was hotter than Key West that day. 8 of the state's top 13 warmest days on record occurred in 2019. Coastal communities are being forced to relocate as homes and other infrastructure erode into the ocean. Animals that depend on sea ice habitats, like walruses, polar bears, and certain species of Arctic seals, will face great challenges as sea ice continues to decrease in this region, as will the indigenous peoples and coastal communities who, for millennia, have depended on these animals and the sea ice to support their culture and way of life. In generational memory, sea ice hunting grounds off the coast of Nome would last through May or even June. This year, they were gone by early March. What happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. Instead, the impacts to the Arctic reverberate across the planet. According to the European Space Agency, melting Alaskan ice has contributed more to global sea level rise than Greenland, Antarctica, or any other part of the world. As Arctic waters warm and sea ice continues to disappear, the region is becoming more accessible to industries and nations interested in using Arctic shipping routes. This could increase global emissions from the shipping sector as nations rush to utilize the new routes, further worsening the threats to the Arctic from climate change. In not only the Arctic, but across the globe, climate change affects fish by changing their environment through changing ocean temperatures, ocean acidification, or losing oxygen from the water. This affects the biology of fish, as well as the relationships between predators and prey, and the timing of important life events. As conditions change, fish populations are shifting their distributions and local abundances are changing. This is already causing a cascade of fishery changes and management challenges. For example, in the Arctic, the sea ice retreat is giving predators new access to schools of walleye pollock, threatening the largest volume fishery in the United States. On the eastern seaboard, black sea bass, a favorite target of anglers in the mid-Atlantic, is beginning to colonize the Gulf of Maine. The impacts of climate change are predicted to lower fisheries catch potential in the world's exclusive economic zones, or the area within the 200-mile limit beyond coastlines, by as much as 25% by 2100, according to the IPCC. We're seeing changes from coast to coast. The global sea level average has risen by about 7 to 8 inches since 1900, with almost half this rise occurring since 1993 as oceans have warmed and land-based ice has melted, and the rate continues to accelerate. Sea level isn't increasing the same amount everywhere, though. Sea level interacts with other coastal factors like groundwater levels to make some regions especially suffer. In South Florida, encroaching seawater is decreasing the function of septic systems. This is bad for the people who rely on them for sewage treatment, it's bad for the region's water supply, and it's dangerous for the health of anyone who contacts floodwaters. By 2040, 64% of county septic tanks in Florida, more than 67,000 of them, could have issues every year. The frequency of this high tide flooding has risen along with sea level. Projections suggest that between $66 billion and $106 billion of U.S. real estate may be underwater by 2050. And now I'm going to pass it to George Leonard, our chief scientist, who will tell us what this all adds up to. George, over to you.
Sarah, are you there?
Indeed.
Excellent. Thanks for the baton handoff. Hi, all. I am coming to you from the West Coast Office of Ocean Conservancy in Santa Cruz, California. And I'd like to shift our gears here and talk about the solutions to many of the problems that Sarah has just described. because all of these impacts are ultimately going to affect our coastal communities, both here in the U.S. and around the world. So here in the U.S., economically significant coastal assets like ports and tourist attractions and fishing sites are increasingly exposed to climate-induced threats like sea level rise and the other flood hazards that Sarah just mentioned. And economic activity in coastal communities and counties accounted for approximately $66 million jobs. That amounts to $6.4 trillion, almost 45% of the nation's gross domestic product. And for example, here in California, where I am, in the San Francisco Bay Area, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, the cost associated with sea level rise is expected to be about $100 billion in property and infrastructure damage. Now, these damages are to things like highways and airports and homes and offices, and they threaten the lives and the prosperity, of course, of the 400,000 people who live along San Francisco Bay's nearly 400-mile shoreline. So certainly there are scientific uncertainties that still exist in the science, and I think we'll see a lot of that in the report from the IPCC tomorrow. But it's clear that from the science we do have that we need to take bold and decisive action now if we want to keep our ocean and indeed our planet healthy both today and for the future. And so while these impacts are certainly daunting, and we expect tomorrow to be a tough day in terms of digging deep into the science, there is some good news here. And the most important thing to remember is that we already know what we need to do. So let's talk about some of these ocean smart climate solutions that we need to consider and how policy advocates like us here at Ocean Conservancy, but many of you on the phone, can respond to what is happening right now and what the science suggests will happen in the future. So as we mentioned, the SROCC report will likely confirm that we need to implement not just a single, but a whole range of approaches to help us confront these impacts. So today I'd like to emphasize essentially 4 buckets of action. So this includes mitigation, that is reducing and sequestering carbon emissions, adaptation measures that we need to take relative to the ocean, ocean climate policy leadership, and then lastly, we'll close out talking a little bit about your individual contribution, indeed all of our individual contributions to addressing ocean climate change. So first, let's start on the mitigation side. And at the global level, the SROCC report will make clear that we must drastically decrease emissions of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, which causes ocean acidification. Now, this is going to require significantly greater ambition than we're currently seeing. As Sarah mentioned, the latest science suggests that limiting warming to 2 degrees, which is the current Paris Agreement, notwithstanding the ambition to put 1.5 degrees out there as a better bar. But 2 degrees is really not good enough for the ocean. We need to keep warming under 1.5 degrees to avoid the worst of climate change impacts on the oceans. And most significantly, we're going to entirely lose our coral reefs around the world at a 2-degree future. And corals at least have a fighting chance at recovery at 1.5 degrees. So that 0.5 degree change really makes a difference in terms of ocean health. These emissions really need to focus specifically on carbon dioxide because this particular greenhouse gas is basically a double whammy for the oceans. It causes both heating and acidification. And of course, both of these drivers need to be addressed to ensure ocean health. So, that's why the climate march that happened last Friday and frankly, Greta Thunberg's really searing testimony that I think probably most of us saw in front of the UN yesterday is really so important. Added urgency and added action for greater global ambition for mitigation is vitally important for the planet as well as the ocean. And it is perhaps the single most important action that needs to happen to benefit the ocean. But the ocean itself can also contribute to the overall goal of carbon emission reductions. The ocean has an important and often overlooked role in contributing to a global drawdown in carbon emissions, and thus the ocean isn't just a victim of climate change. While it is very much a victim of climate change, it is also an important part of the overall solution to climate change itself. And I'm going to highlight three specific ways that this can happen. The first is increasing natural carbon sequestration via protecting and restoring what are called blue carbon habitats. The second is advancing ocean renewable energy, and the third is reducing emissions from the shipping sector. So let's take each of these in turn. With respect to the first we need to redouble our efforts to protect the ocean's natural ability to store carbon. And this involves both protecting and restoring coastal blue carbon ecosystems. And these are specifically defined as mangroves and salt marshes and seagrasses. And these coastal ecosystems and their associated food webs not only suck up carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and the seawater at per unit area rates that can be up to 4 times greater than terrestrial forests, but they also provide essential buffering services that can limit the impact of erosion and flooding and storms, all while providing critical and vital habitat for fish and other wildlife. Now, to do this, we must fully halt the loss of coastal wetlands. But even if only half of the annual coastal wetland loss was halted, emissions would be reduced by an amount essentially equivalent to offsetting the 2013 emissions from the country of Spain. And if we are successful at restoring coastal wetlands to their 1990 extent, it would increase annual carbon sequestration by an amount broadly equivalent to preventing the burning of nearly 100 million tons of coal. But make no mistakes, make no mistake, because the stakes are quite high. If we fully lose our coastal blue habitats, our coastal blue carbon, we risk the release of up to 50 gigatons of carbon being lost back into the atmosphere that otherwise would have been locked away in these natural systems. So that's one action. The second action is to advance renewable energy in and on the ocean itself. Now, the ocean offers key avenues to develop clean and renewable power, and smartly sited offshore energy production could be responsible for up to 23 gigatons of reduction in emissions by 2050. And this is a significant contribution to the overall reduction in emissions that's needed to stabilize the planet. The third avenue to think about today is to reduce emissions from the commercial shipping sector. Shipping now accounts for about 90% of global trade, and it currently accounts for about 3% of global carbon emissions. But most troubling, shipping emissions are actually predicted to increase up to about 18% of global emissions by 2050 under a business as usual scenario. So that's a pretty big number. And the shipping sector can take immediate actions now and move towards zero emission propulsion technology in the future that would truly make shipping ocean and climate friendly. So that's the mitigation space that we think is relevant for the conversation around the role of oceans in climate. What about adaptation and resiliency? So clearly the ocean has an important role to play in mitigation, but there are also a host of specific measures that need to be taken to adapt to the changes in oceans that are already underway and will continue to get worse, even if we're successful in our efforts in the short run to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to highlight a couple here today. The first is from a coastal adaptation and sea level rise perspective. We must prioritize measures to help coastal communities and businesses adapt not just to rising sea levels, but remember, sea level rise is itself accelerating, and to the heightened risk of extreme events that come with this. And those activities include priority for green infrastructure, which is essentially protecting coastal habitats that buffer against bigger waves, instead of focusing our money and our time and our political power on building, for example, concrete seawalls. as well as considering a topic called managed retreat, which is essentially to equitably move entire intact communities if in fact adapting to sea level rise becomes locally untenable. Now, the second important adaptive action centers on ocean protection, specifically marine protected areas. The use of smartly designed, well-enforced, and well-managed marine protected areas can help conserve ocean ecosystems and biodiversity in the face of climate change. We know, and scientists do know, that MPAs work. They increase the biomass, the biodiversity, the size, and the reproductive output of the species within them. And conservation science indicates that to secure the future ecological functioning of the ocean, as well as habitats on land, interestingly enough, at least 30% of the global ocean should be protected via an effectively planned network of protected areas that incorporate the full range of habitats and species across the global ocean. If we do this, this will enhance species diversity and abundance, and it will provide intact habitats to allow species to move with the changing ocean conditions that Sarah was mentioning before. Now, along with an expanded use of MPAs, we can't forget about the other stressors that we're already putting on the ocean. The amount of stress we already place in the ocean through things like overfishing and chemical pollution, nutrient runoff, and plastic pollution needs to decrease to alleviate the extra pressure that climate change is imposing on ocean health. Measures to better manage the ocean and protect it from these stressors can ensure that it is better able to handle the effects of climate change, such as increased acidification, marine heat waves, and ocean suffocation. One important tool, and it is only one important tool to achieve these goals, is to advance regional ocean planning. As pressures mount and as more and more user groups want access to the ocean, regional ocean planning can prioritize sustainable ocean use by both thinking and acting with the entirety of marine ecosystems and their many competing uses in mind. Now, effective planning is empowered by open access to robust and diverse data streams on both the status of the ocean itself and the scale and the impact of ocean industry and other users. So the shorthand here is we need more and better science to adequately adapt to climate change in the ocean. Now, one final comment here around adaptation. Lastly, as we work to better adapt to ocean changes, we must ensure that decisions and processes are inclusive and equitable. Those terms are important. The communities that are most impacted by climate change, oftentimes communities of color or indigenous people, as well as those that are historically disadvantaged or of lower income, have generally been left out of climate decision making. We need to listen to the communities that live and deal with the impacts of climate change on a daily basis. And we need to ensure that they have a seat at the table from the beginning when planning for and responding to ocean climate impacts. Okay, so that's our second bucket. Remember, we've talked about mitigation, now adaptation. Let's move to the third. So the ocean, as I think we've argued, has a clear role to play in both mitigation and adaptation, but we also need leadership from ocean climate policymakers if we really want to have a functional ocean going forward. Now, the good news is that the global community is really beginning to take note. And as you likely all know, countries from around the world will be convening in Chile in December for the Conference of Parties, the COP25. And this is the community of nations that is implementing the historic Paris Agreement on climate change. Now, COP25 has already been dubbed the Blue COP because of the ocean, thanks to the host country, Chile, putting such a bright spotlight on the intersection of oceans and climate. So we think this is going to be a key moment in time for countries to make concrete commitments to actions on behalf of the ocean. And as you also know, this work is beginning in earnest this week in New York at the UN Climate Week, with a robust discussion of the importance of achieving not just a 2-degree, but a 1.5-degree future. But it is clear just from the news coming out this morning that current commitments being made at the global level are still falling short. So the most important action that governments can take is to set their own ambitious goals, their own targets, and their own implementation plans to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions while simultaneously working to emphasize the ocean's vital role in climate mitigation and adaptation among their peer group. So here in the U.S., I don't think I have to tell any of you that it is no surprise that the current administration is weakening environmental regulations across the board, including, of course, on climate change. But states across the U.S. are stepping up to provide continued leadership on the ocean climate nexus. And I'll just highlight a couple here. For example, I'm in California, and the California legislature has passed several ocean-relevant climate adaptation bills in the last several legislative sessions. And the state's Ocean Protection Council has made climate change one of its top priorities going forward. So as the California current off our coast continues to change, the blob is in fact back here. Proactive engagement by scientists and management agencies, the state legislature, and Governor Newsom are models for how to confront ocean climate change head on. But there is leadership elsewhere, of course, and on the East Coast in Maine, state legislatures there have included ocean climate language as part of a larger climate bill that passed just this spring. So in addition to setting aggressive mitigation targets, this bill contains specific actions on coastal risks and hazards, as well as establishes a statewide climate change council that includes a working group on coastal and marine issues. So in this time of, dare I say, limited federal leadership, state-level climate policy is a key arena where ocean advocates can make themselves heard and voice their support for smart and effective climate action. Now, while leadership at the highest level is vitally needed, all of you on the phone today also have an important role to play in our ocean climate future. So our fourth and final action is about how you can help spread the message and galvanize action. And at this week's, as this week's climate strike made clear, the chorus of voices calling for action on climate change is getting louder and harder to ignore. The release of the SROCC report tomorrow represents a significant moment in time when the ocean will take center stage in these larger discussions. And as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, the report is an in-depth, globally vetted assessment of the best existing science, and it affirms the need for action now. We need advocates to call on states and Congress to ensure that ocean solutions are part of an ambitious strategy to tackle climate change. And so let me highlight several ways that you can help elevate that message in your communication efforts. First, remind your audience of the role and the function of the ocean. It is really no exaggeration to say that the ocean is the life support system for the planet. A critical function of the ocean is to absorb heat and carbon dioxide, and over millennia, this function has created a system that is essentially responsible for marine life as we know it today, as well as life on land. Second, don't open the door to debate about the reality of climate change. Establish that climate change and its ocean impacts are a real problem that is happening today. Climate change is not some abstract problem in the future. Just look around us. Unfortunately, climate change is happening everywhere, including many of the coastal communities in which you live and work. Now, science tells us a lot about what is happening, but your personal experiences are an important part of the overall story of climate change. Which brings me to the third recommendation, and that's to tell stories of people. Now, much as Sarah and I love the science, and we do love the science, your climate change messaging should focus on the stories of people and communities and businesses that are directly impacted by climate change, including both economic and environmental effects. Use the science to support these stories, but remember, most people are motivated by other people, not by graphs and numbers. And lastly, let's focus on solutions. The science we will hear tomorrow, I can guarantee you, is likely to be grim. Climate change is very much a gut punch to the health of the ocean. But there are solutions and actions that we can take. Indeed, we must take them in response to this new information. So communicate that it is not too late, because it isn't too late, that action can be taken, and that all peoples have a role in the future of our ocean. As we've discussed today, to implement a strong ocean climate action agenda, we essentially need to do three fundamental things. We need to substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions, especially carbon dioxide. We need to protect the ocean's natural ability to store carbon and to contribute to climate change mitigation. And lastly, we need to implement a portfolio of adaptation strategies to confront the unavoidable impacts of climate change. Now, Ocean Conservancy is your partner in this effort. We hope you're inspired to take strong ocean climate action, because the ocean's future really does depend on it. So thanks for everybody for listening. Today, I will hand this back to Adam and Theo in DC, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, George. This is Adam. We have a lot of people with us today, maybe a record for an Ocean Conservancy webinar. Thank you all so much for your interest and for attending as we discuss this incredibly important topic and ways that we can move forward and make progress. Because there are so many folks with us today, we're going to do our Q&A a little bit differently than we've done in the past on Ocean Conservancy webinars, for those of you who've joined us before. I will be taking questions via the question functionality in the GoToWebinar app. You can also send me a direct chat, and I'll be monitoring those and relaying those questions to our panelists. We may not be able to make it to all the questions in the time allotted, and apologies in advance to anybody whose question I can't fit in. I or one of the panelists will be sure to follow up with you later. As I've been talking, we've actually received a question from our colleague, Jeff Slyfield here at Ocean Conservancy. And he asks, George, you mentioned a few state-level policies. Are there other examples? Are there any best practices that other states or places should look at and maybe take a lesson from?
Yeah, and I'd ask Sarah to contribute her thoughts on this too. I mentioned briefly the Ocean Protection Council out here. I wanted to identify what I think is a really novel approach to dealing with ocean health in general, but this is becoming increasingly important in the climate space relative to ocean. And it's this unique body of governmental kind of agencies and teams that work in the state. The first is the Ocean Protection Council, which is essentially a coordinating body amongst all the government agencies at the state level that have something to do with oceans. And the second is a standalone body established by the legislature, referred to as the OST, the Ocean Science Trust, which is a standalone entity that harnesses the best scientific information from scientists around the state, and then funnels that information in a very coordinated and integrated way into state policy through the OPC. And this really unique body, this unique pair of bodies where science and policy is integrated and worked on collaboratively on a regular basis, is really, really well positioned to deal with climate change, which is increasing in its magnitude out here. And I think that other states, it's a good model for how other subnational governments can really essentially bridge this divide, if you will, often between the scientific community and the policy community. So that would be one I would highlight, but I'd kick it over to you, Sarah, for some ideas on your end too.
Yeah, thanks. I think California is a great example, as George said, but that's kind of an example of what you can do when you have a very big system with, sort of a lot of progressive energy and fairly large budget, quite honestly, to help support all that. You mentioned Maine in your remarks, George, and I think Maine is an important state to offer as a counterexample. Maine is really an interesting place because people who live in Maine often live there because of the natural world. they choose to live there because of its beauty and its connections to the ocean and the forests and things like that. And so there's a lot of citizen energy for caring for the environment. And so the example that George mentioned briefly in Maine is interesting because Maine doesn't have deep pockets to work on this. But the energy of citizens has really contributed to the passage of some climate-related language in this larger climate bill, and really focusing on the oceans. And Maine has been a place that I've been following for quite some time with my ocean acidification work, because the ocean acidification work in the state of Maine has largely been driven forward on an enduring basis by a community partnership. So the Maine Ocean and Coastal Acidification Partnership, which is really an all-volunteer group of folks from scientists to state legislators to resource managers to conservation organizations who are thinking about how to build out ocean acidification monitoring and responses in the state of Maine. And, you know, they've been able to do that on a shoestring, and it's really been a testament to the passion of the citizens to drive it forward. So I really like to compare California to Maine and show that, you know, you can have a very different situation in terms of pretty much every indicator you could imagine, and yet there's this ongoing energy to make a difference. And so we see a lot of really great results from both. And what's interesting is, you know, kind of using the ocean acidification work as an example. And a couple of years ago, my colleagues in the ocean acidification program and I put together an assessment of how communities can begin to take action on acidification. And that assessment looked at it from, you know, a couple of perspectives. If someone is an elected leader, or if someone is simply just a community leader or a committed citizen. And so we followed sort of the best practices that really support ongoing engagement on acidification. And a lot of those principles can be pivoted to other ocean issues as well. So if folks are interested in that, we'd be happy to circulate that as a bit of a deeper dive. It is a marine policy publication in the peer-reviewed literature. So it, you know, runs on the technical side, but we tried to keep it pretty simple compared to, for example, the IPCC's report language, which is very dense. Adam, do we have other questions?
Yes, thank you, George and Sarah. We have a question from Parker Gassett. Restoring and protecting coastal habitat seems like one of the most reliable tools for environmental resilience to climate change. Can the market do this through ecosystem services, or do we need a political direction?
Hi, Parker. This is Sarah. I'll grab that one. Thanks for joining our webinar. It's nice to have you with us. I think that's a really interesting question you raise. If I understand correctly, you're kind of wondering, is that something that we can sort of rely on the natural world and folks who are supporting the natural world, or do we need sort of a top-down government push to actually get that done? Is that what I got, Adam?
I believe so.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think I haven't come down to a decision on that one, really, honestly. But
yeah, I'm with you on that one, Sarah.
Yeah. But I think it's definitely a worthwhile question to explore in more depth. One of the problems I see with sort of a top-down push would be that a lot of times top-down efforts to sustain ecosystems and the services they provide really require attaching a dollar value to the services so that they fit into current cost-benefit types of decisions or go, no-go decisions. And really, the economic science on that is still kind of all over the place. There's a lot of different methods that people like to use for these kinds of things, and there's not a lot of agreement on which way is best. There have been efforts to attach a price to carbon. The social cost of carbon work that the U.S. government led a few years ago is a very prime example, and folks can easily look up that information online if you're not familiar with that effort. And I think it's a start, but I think what I saw in that previous cost of carbon work is that not all of the consequences of carbon dioxide were really included. Because again, this whole, like, it's really hard to wrap up the value of a wetland, for example, in taking up carbon dioxide and returning oxygen to the atmosphere. So I guess I'd need to really think hard on sort of the policy implications of, sort of top-down versus bottom-up pushes. But where I stand right now, Parker, is really that I would love to see more development on summing up ecosystem services in ways that aren't necessarily economic, because I think that's going to help show decision makers the full scope of what we gain from the natural environment. So I definitely think, more work is needed, but certainly not exactly work in the way that we may have seen in the past with, economic valuation and such. So I'd be happy to talk about that at length at a later date. Tough question.
And we have a question from DJ Schubert. He lays out a lot of stuff, but I think I'm reading this mostly correctly. Thank you for mentioning blue carbon. Can you speak to the importance of protecting great whales as a natural means of combating climate change?
Sure, I'll jump in there. This is an issue that is near and dear to my heart, and we're doing some early work in thinking this through here at Ocean Conservancy. If I can broaden this out a little bit, to me this is the question of what is the value of the rest of the biology that lives in the ocean beyond blue carbon proper. And there are some real hints out there that I think things other than seagrasses and salt marshes and mangroves play an important role here, and whales is part of this. But I referenced food webs in my comments, and there's some interesting studies that have shown in blue carbon habitats that the top predators in those systems, often species like sea otters or sharks or large fishes, can have big implications on the ability of the vegetation in those habitats to draw down carbon. And this is well understood in the ecological community, in the academic marine science community, associated with what's called top-down trophic cascades. And it turns out that trophic cascades not only impact the number of animals or the biomass of prey at the bottom of a food web, it also turns out that it can have implications on carbon. So the real question is, how general is that idea? And there's some intriguing work that has been done by a group named Grid Arundel. There's some really interesting work that a blog that I actually just took a look at yesterday that came out around the whale question. And I think there are a huge number of sort of fundamental science questions around just how much carbon is in the rest of marine animals. Where does that carbon go? Does it move into the deep sea at time scales that are broadly considered relevant to mitigation and international policy? I think there are probably more questions than there are answers at this point. But my guess, if I had to make a bet about it, is that the biology of our ocean, particularly if we could restore the ocean, could have a much bigger role in terms of fundamental aspects of carbon mitigation than we currently recognize.
Great, and we have a question from April, and the question is, what is the SROCC process? How does it work?
I can take that one, Adam. The SROCC process, like all the IPCC processes, it's kind of like a, I think of one of these epic films, the kind of like 3-hour things that Hollywood used to create with like an intermission and stuff. And the reason I say that is because they really it's a cast of thousands to get the job done. IPCC reports are sort of scoped at the governmental level. The need for a report is established. Governments say, yes, here's what we would like to see in those reports. And then nations will nominate their best scientists and issue experts to go ahead and bring together and assess the evidence that we have. And what's interesting about that is that it's more than just a typical scientific review where you might say, well, you know, we're going to talk about marine plankton, and some people say that this is true, but there's one or two results that say that is true, and in general the results are mixed. More science is needed. But in contrast, the IPCC process really, the authors take the evidence and they kind of quantitatively evaluate. Are we looking at, the vast majority of the research on a particular topic is pointing to a specific outcome? How confident are we in that outcome? What's the likelihood, like the probability associated with any future projections? And so they really quantitatively go through the results to look at where the weight of the evidence lies, to get an even more detailed handle on what the research is saying. And as the scientists do that, there are a number of rounds of review by other experts not involved in the process, as well as government experts and scientists, and folks from really all over the world. They take great pains to get everyone's perspective included. And then when the products come out, a lot of times, there's a temptation to say, oh, we knew that already. We knew that, there were serious climate impacts on the ocean. But what's new here is really this very diligent assessment of what the weight of the evidence is telling us, how fast, how strong effects are, where exactly they're going to be happening, and how likely certain outcomes are. So that's a little snippet of the process. It's really a very involved and kind of poorly understood process. So that was a great question. Thanks for that.
Great. Thank you, Sarah and April, for the question. Let's see, what's the next one? This one is from Melissa Abdo, and it says, at a local and regional level, scientists are often best able to influence fisheries management plans as a policy action related to oceans. Is there solid data, is there science that we can cite to help us advocate for marine reserves, primarily as a fishery management tool, but to benefit climate goals?
Sure, I'll jump on that. So there was a lot there, but let me wax philosophic a little bit about marine protected areas. Folks may not know that one of Ocean Conservancy's signature achievements in our over 40-year history was the working with many of our colleagues here in California to establish the first statewide network of fully protected areas along the 1,000-mile or so California coast. And a lot has been learned from that process. There's a large body of science that has been implemented since the reserve network went in place, and there's a big process undergoing right now to essentially evaluate the effectiveness from them, from both a biodiversity conservation and a fishery enhancement perspective. So there's a lot to learn from the California experience, and I think there's sort of two take-homes. The first, as I mentioned earlier, they work in a sense that if you establish protected areas, you get essentially bigger and more fish and a variety of other non-fish marine animals in them. So they are quite effective in terms of biodiversity conservation. But it also looks like the evidence suggests that they can play a complementary role to traditional fishery management. They are certainly no replacement for fishery management, but they can help because of spillover effects, both from large fish essentially swimming outside and being caught outside their borders, but also from reproduction within marine protected areas, drifting outside of the network, and then establishing juveniles in non-protected areas. So I think that the science is pretty good there. From a fishery management perspective, those are often with respect to coastal fisheries, which are different than reserves that might be set up, for example, in the open ocean or to protect more migratory species. And I think the fishery benefits there are at present, the scientific evidence is more limited there. One particular publication I would steer people to, which I think, frankly, the conservation community that works on oceans needs to think a little more hard about, is a paper by Dinnerstein and a number of colleagues that came out in 2019 in Science Advances called The Global Deal for Nature. And it's a pretty compelling synthesis of both terrestrial and marine conservation science related to the potential the biodiversity benefits of protected areas, kind of at the global level. You know, this included a number of big thinkers, folks like Henri Sala and Thomas Lovejoy, and have made, I think, a pretty compelling case about how we need to think about the future of protected areas in the ocean. And I think that if you look closely at that, there's a number of specific aspects related to both protection from, you know, over-harvesting on the one hand, and as a potential complement to traditional fishery management, but also in terms of improving, you know, biodiversity. I think folks are probably aware there was the IPBES report that came out that the headline was, you know, 1 million species are under threat for extinction, and the oceans are right in there with the land. So we have to think, I think, both conceptually, but also from a policy and advocacy perspective, how to bring the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis together in the oceans, because frankly, we need to solve both of those simultaneously.
Great, thank you, George. And we've had more than a couple questions related to the effects of offshore wind development, and I just want to try to wrap them up overall and just be, are scientists looking at the effect of offshore energy development on the oceans and oceanic life?
Adam, I can take that. Yes, absolutely. There is always site review that happens for any kind of placement in the ocean. And one of the big considerations of smart ocean planning is to really make room for not just ocean uses, but also the ecosystems that live in those places already. So there's absolutely stringent review and consideration of how renewable energy in the ocean is interacting with marine life. On the topic of marine renewables, that's an area where there's some really exciting, scientific developments that are happening right now. So just last week, the Energy Department and NOAA just announced a $3 million prize competition to accelerate development of ocean data platforms powered by renewable marine energy. So one of the challenges we face is needing more energy to power coastal and marine activities. So I'm really looking to exciting programs like that for innovations in how we're going to actually harvest renewable energy from the ocean, be it through, tidal or wave energy, wind energy, and really do it well in a way that is mindful of the needs of everyone, including the life in the ocean.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, again, for joining us, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Apologies to those whose questions I was not able to get to. We're now at 1 p.m., and I'd like to, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and I'd like to hand it over to Theo to wrap up this wonderful call.
Excellent. Well, I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you very much, Dr. Cooley and Dr. Leonard, for sharing all this information with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And a big thank you to everyone who joined us and attended the webinar. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy weeks to join us this afternoon. So just as a reminder, the SROCC report that we've been talking about will be released tomorrow. It's actually getting released in Monaco, so it's going to be on European time. So it'll be released at 5 a.m. Eastern time, and you'll be able to find it online on the IPCC.
Coffee.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're looking to really, as George was mentioning, sort of add your voice, in particular in response to the report's release, if you look on the sidebar of the GoToWebinar app open on your screen, there's a handout section there And in there, you'll find some social media and messaging guidance about, general ocean climate action, but also about the SROCC report itself, and that's available for download from that handout section. And the link to the SROCC report, where it will live, can also be found in that document. And then also in the handout section on the sidebar are some copies of some of the infographics that you saw in today's presentation. If you don't want to download all of that right now, that is totally fine. We are going to be sending a follow-up email to everyone who attended the webinar today, and we will include these materials as attachments, along with a link to the recording of today's webinar as well. So also feel free to follow up to that email with any further questions, especially if maybe you had a question that we were not able to ask today. But with that, I will just once again say thank you to everyone for joining us, and I wish everyone the best and finish this Climate Week strong.
Yes, thank you for your commitment, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.